So an FAO a number of years ago crunched the numbers on how much corn and wheat goes into biofuels, and that number's up now. But at the time, they found that about 100 million metric tons of corn and wheat was going into biofuels. And the UN Special Envoy on Food at the time, he declared that biofuels are a crime against humanity because they are creating competition for corn and wheat to create fuel, as opposed to feeding people who are in extreme poverty. The thing that was not mentioned at that time, and that continues to not be mentioned, is that at that point, 756 million metric tons of corn and wheat were fed to chickens and pigs and other farm animals. That doesn't even include the something just shy of 80% of soy, which is another couple hundred million metric pounds of crops that are fed to farm animals, basically so that people in developed economies can eat chicken and pork and beef. When you crunch the numbers, what you find is that to grow crops to feed them to a chicken, which according to the World Resources Institute is the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat, takes about 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out in the form of chicken meat. So that's 9 times as much land, 9 times as much water, 9 times the pesticides and herbicides. And it's not just that, you're growing all of those crops and you're shipping them to a feed mill and you're operating a feed mill, and then you're shipping the feed to the farm and you're operating the farm, and you're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse and you're operating the slaughterhouse. When you crunch all of these numbers, you end up with a massive climate impact, even from a pure CO2 vantage. It's multiple extra stages of gas guzzling pollution spewing vehicles. It's multiple extra factories, including the factory farm. All of those are resource intensive. All of those are also vastly polluting. And that doesn't even get to, and so this is our friends at Project Drawdown put this together when they crunched the numbers in terms of climate impact. And you can see that moving toward a plant-rich diet, it's literally 6 times as powerful as a climate solution in keeping climate change under 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to electric vehicles, which obviously get vastly more attention. Another one that I think is sort of interesting is food waste. So in environmental circles, there's a lot of consternation around the idea that something like 40% of food produced globally is wasted. People don't think about the fact that if you're producing chicken, there is literally 800% food waste baked into chicken production. It takes 9 calories in to get 1 calorie back out. People are horrified about food waste, and yet every time you choose to eat chicken, you're eating something where 8 of the 9 calories that went into production, the chicken either burned off existing, or it went into bones or blood or feathers or something that human beings don't consume. So it's literally 800% food waste. According to WRI, 40 calories in for 1 calorie of beef. Most farmed fish are 9 or 10 calories in for 1 calorie back out. The food waste involved, just inherent in the production system, is overwhelming. And that doesn't even go into this chart. So when I say, I was doing P, when I say neglected climate solution, if you look at this and plant-rich diet versus things like nuclear and electric vehicles, and how much you hear about plant-rich diet, very, very little, which we'll get to in just a second. And that doesn't even include the methane and the nitrous oxide. So the plurality of methane and the plurality of nitrous oxide that are produced. And methane is about 30 times as powerful as a greenhouse gas, 80 times over the next 20 years, which is really probably the period that we should be looking at. Nitrous oxide is 300 times as powerful as a greenhouse gas. And the top cause of methane is ruminant digestion. And the top cause of nitrous oxide is manure decomposition. So even if we transitioned entirely to renewable energy and electric vehicles, the amount of methane and nitrous oxide obviously doesn't go down at all. So this is the IPCC report from earlier in the year. The main causes of climate change are the heat-absorbing greenhouse gases released by fossil fuel combustion, as well as deforestation, and animal agriculture is a big part of that, as I will talk about in just a minute, and agriculture, which warm the planet. And you find the New York Times, maybe six weeks ago, devoted an entire page of the Sunday New York Times, probably the most important real estate in daily news, maybe in the world, definitely in the United States, an entire page excoriating the planet, excoriating the public, and excoriating policymakers on climate change. And they, harken back to James Hansen and Senate testimony in 1988. And how many times do you think they mentioned agriculture? 0. An entire page, probably, they very rarely give an entire page of the Sunday paper to anything. I don't remember ever seeing it before. An entire page, all about policy solutions, and the only thing they talked about was fossil fuels. They talked about renewable energy. They talked about electrification of transport. They did not talk about agriculture, which is roughly a third of climate change, and it is almost entirely neglected. 2 other things to talk about, just to toss in. I notice the title of this talk is the Neglected Climate Solution, but I do just want to mention 2 other borderline existential risks to humanity that the way that we produce meat right now is significantly contributing to. The first one is antibiotic resistance. The UK government about 6 years ago said the threat to the human race from antibiotic resistance is more certain than the threat from climate change. The former head of the World Health Organization, Margaret Chan, said if antibiotics stop working, that is literally the end of modern medicine. And something like 65 to 75% of all antibiotics produced by the entire pharmaceutical industry globally are fed to farm animals to keep those animals alive in conditions that would otherwise kill them or to cause them to grow more quickly. And oftentimes when I'm talking about this in Europe, people will say, well, Europe is going to ban antibiotics. It is a big issue in Europe. And maybe not, but Brazil's not gonna, the US is not going to, China's not going to. And I don't think the Europeans can expect antibiotic resistance to say, oh, Europe's banned the use of therapeutic use of antibiotics in farm animals. We're not going to go in here and make people sick. Literally talking about 10 million people a year dying from antibiotic resistance by 2050 on our current trajectory at a cost to the global economy of $10 trillion. And a huge part of it, this was the front page of the New York Times Magazine maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, and it's talking about antibiotic use in pigs in China. But chickens get even more antibiotics than pigs. So there's chickens and then pigs and then cattle for antibiotic use. And then pandemic risk. I am wearing a mask because of a pandemic. Something like more than 100 million people went into extreme poverty as a result of COVID-19. And this was not a particularly transmissible or a particularly deadly pandemic relative to what might have been. And that's something to underline about climate change, about antibiotic resistance, and about pandemic risk. They hurt the people globally who can least adapt. In other words, they hurt the people, the 100 million plus people who were sent into extreme poverty, which was on a positive trajectory and got set back significantly by COVID-19, which again wasn't that bad as a pandemic could have been. So UN Environment Program in July of 2020 listed the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. The first one is increased meat production. The second one, because the more animals you have, the more likely they're going to have a zoonotic disease. The second one was intensification of animal agriculture, because the more you cram animals together, the more likely they are to get sick and create a zoonotic disease. The 7th one is climate change, which we've been talking about. So really 3 colossal risks from the way that we're producing meat right now. Climate change, didn't even talk about biodiversity loss, but that's sort of or partial climate change, as well as antibiotic resistance, as well as pandemic risk. So what's the solution? Chatham House, foremost think tank in Europe, released a report maybe 5 or 6 years ago about the climate impact of meat production. And their solution was governments need to get on board with telling people to eat less meat. China, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, one province in China said they were going to encourage the population to eat half as much meat by 2030. What do you think's happened in that province of China in terms of meat production? Yeah, it's going up. And I will say, we see headlines like this constantly. The EatLancet Report came out, I guess, a couple of years ago now. The year before that, there was a massive peer review report. The year before that, there was a massive peer review report. The year before that, there was a massive peer review report. Like, none of the stuff I've been talking about is unknown. I don't have to uncover any of this. People who read know about these issues. Education has not solved the problem. The areas of the world that have the most understanding of the existential risks of how we produce meat today have not seen a decrease in meat consumption. Even the United States, 2019 was the highest per capita meat consumption in recorded history. And some people gloss over per capita and it's like, oh yeah, but our population's growing. No, per capita, 2019 was the highest per capita meat consumption in the US in recorded history until 2020 when it went up. Despite these headlines, so this is, the UN says 70 to 100% more meat by 2050. And most of that increase is in developing economies, not developed economies. Where, I mean, I agree with the critique. It would smack of colonialism for us to go into developing economies and say, yeah, we eat 10 times as much meat as you do, but look at this graph, you can't eat as much meat. It would smack of colonialism, and it also wouldn't work. So what's the solution? The solution, big fans of education at GFI, and just generally me personally. I think education, it's how I change my diet. I think it's important, but it clearly is not what is going to get us. It's not going to make a dent in this. It hasn't made a dent in it so far. And the sort of happy concept of the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. We need a radical new way of thinking about meat. And instead of trying to change people's diets and behaviors, let's change the meat. So Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate in economics, he talks about systems one thinking and systems two thinking. So systems one thinking is instinctual. He refers to it as click work. And systems two thinking is ethical, it's intellectual, it's thought-based. We are convinced at GFI that food is systems one thinking. And there is an overwhelming amount of social science to indicate that that's true. So a pollster asks, do you care about farm animal welfare? Or do you care about the environmental impact of your food or whatever? And the person is in systems two thinking, and they say, yes, this is important to me. And then they are in the grocery store and they're hungry and they're buying food, or they're in the restaurant and they're hungry and they're buying food, or they're at the cafe and they're hungry and they're buying food. And people are interested in, is it delicious and is it reasonably priced? These are the things that dictate consumer choice. Whole Foods is about 2% of grocery. Made its name on organic and healthy food. Go to your local Whole Foods and look at what people are buying. It's really crap, even at Whole Foods. Go to Target, go to Walmart, go to Kroger. Look at the line at Popeyes or KFC. Watch MSNBC and other sort of progressive television and listen to how they talk about the glories of KFC and Popeye and even Chick-fil-A. People are not making their decisions on the basis of even health, which is definitely third, but a distant third. Food is click work, food is systems one, food is it delicious and is it reasonably priced? That's how we decide what we're going to eat. And fortunately, we can make meat from plants. So up until Ethan Brown and Pat Brown, who are not related, but are the two sort of trendsetters in thinking about meat in a different way. Ethan Brown founded Beyond Meat, Pat Brown founded Impossible Foods. Both of them came out of the environmental community. Ethan was working in clean energy. Pat was a tenured professor of biochemistry at Stanford, founder of the PLOS Library of Science, among other notable achievements. And they both sort of realized, so they both were, had it sort of click for them, the degree to which the way that we produce meat now is causing all of the harms that I was just describing. And they realized, hey, meat is made up of lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. That is all meat is. Plants also have lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. we can make something that is bioidentical to animal meat, but we can do it from plants. And because the process is so much more efficient, as it scales up, it will cost less. And up until they came along, and a lot of people still think about plant-based meat as for vegetarians and flexitarians. It's for people who will pay a little bit more and will sacrifice on the biomimicry. They don't care if it tastes like animal meat, or they're willing to give up a little bit in order to live in deeper alignment with their ethics. And really, that plant-based meat, up until Ethan and Pat came along, plant-based meat was, let's take the soy from the soybean oil industry, the soy protein, or let's take the wheat from the pasta and bread industries, the wheat protein, and let's cream it together, make it look like a burger, and force vegetarians to eat it. That was basically plant-based meat until Ethan and Pat came along. And you can probably get to some billions of dollars as a market sector, even in the United States, with products that cost more and don't biomimic. But the brainstorm of Pat and Ethan was, our market is not vegetarians. Our market is not flexitarians. Our market is not people who think ethically when they think about food. Our market is everybody who eats. We can make a product that is healthier for people, that is safer for people, that has a fraction of the climate impact, that requires a fraction of the land, and that gives consumers everything they like about meat. It will cost less, and it will taste the same or better. At GFI, we are convinced that there is a fair number of people who really just want to eat actual animal meat. It is a different product. We think we can biomimic meat with plants. We think we can give people the precise sensory experience at a lower price. But some people want to eat actual animal protein. For them, we can cultivate the cells. We can use standard tissue engineering techniques. And right now, you cultivate a seed, and the seed grows, and that's a plant. You can take a biopsy the size of a sesame seed from a cow or a pig or a chicken or a fish. You can bathe those cells in nutrients. Those cells will multiply and grow. And out the other side comes some actual animal meat that is safer. Wrong direction. Out comes actual animal meat. It's literally the exact same product. If it's fish, there is no dioxin, there is no mercury contamination. If it's farm animals, there is no pesticide residue. There is no. Nicholas Kristof for the New York Times did an amazing column about some GHU research. They found Benadryl in chicken. They found Prozac in chicken. They found aspirin in chicken. The drugs that are fed to the animals, the FDA and USDA will say, well, they're not at unsafe levels. But how much do you want to be eating in Prozac in your chicken, even if it's not technically at unsafe levels? So too with pesticide residues, so too with bacterial contamination. You literally have the exact same product at a lower price, but safer for people and their families. And this is what production looks like at scale. So essentially your friendly neighborhood meat brewery. Takes about 6 to 7 weeks to get a chicken to slaughter weight. If you grow the cells directly in cultivators, you can get that same growth in 6 days. A far more efficient process that as it scales up, we should be able to get to the exact same product at a lower price and safer for people and their families. So what are the environmental impacts? Early numbers are excellent. So the Impossible and the Beyond Burger are the sort of 2 quintessential examples of what I'm talking about. The Impossible Burger requires less than, thinking that the P should work. The PowerPoint, the P works for previous, but about a 20th of the land and something like 90% less climate change. And the climate change numbers are just going to get better and better and better. As the economies of scale kick in, and as production practices get better, and as they hone production and cultivation of the products, the climate change numbers get even better, but it's already roughly a 20th of the land. With cultivated meat, 95% less land relative to beef, almost a fourth, so 1/3.5, almost a fourth of the land relative to chicken, with a 17% lower climate impact for chicken, half a climate impact for pork, and 92% less climate impact for beef. Bill Gates, it's the one, so when Bill Gates launched Breakthrough Energy in February, a spinoff of Breakthrough Energy Ventures, and he also launched his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. This is the one solution that Gates is enthusiastic about on food and land. With a bunch of his interviews, he was talking about how food and land has really been the third rail of climate policy. That's the reason I don't think the New York Times suppressed food and land. I think the fact that the climate community has been so thoroughly focused on renewables means that it just wasn't on the radar, which is remarkable. It's a third of climate impact, and the climate community is sort of so despondent about food and land solutions that they don't talk about it enough for the New York Times to sort of even notice that they've left it out of their global exploration of the policy community for not taking climate change seriously. And that's what Bill was talking about when he launched this book and he launched Breakthrough Energy. And he said, he's talking about cultivated meat here, but it's true for both cultivated and plant-based meat. Well, cultivated doesn't have, plant-based doesn't have all the same fat, muscles, and tendons, which cultivated does. But in both cases, little or no greenhouse gas emissions aside from the electricity you need to power the facilities where the process is done. So obviously, one of the outcries of the climate movement is electrify everything. This is electrify everything for me. It takes the nitrous oxide and the methane from manure digestion and ruminant digestion from being the top cause of both those greenhouse gases to zero as you move production in factories. Also requires a fraction of the land. There was something in Our World in Data a couple of months ago said that food production requires 4 billion hectares of land. 3 billion of those hectares of land are for animal agriculture. That is the size of China plus India ×2 plus Indonesia. So one of the things that we didn't talk about so far is biodiversity, and just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go a lot into biodiversity, but the amount of land that is freed up, and this is where I talk about Matt's paper, and Matt's right here. So Matthew, a paper in Nature Sustainability, talks about the opportunity cost of all of the massive amounts of land that is dedicated to industrial animal agriculture. And if that land were used as part of a coherent climate strategy, and that land were put into ecosystem reconstruction, you're literally talking about 26 gigatons of CO2 that could be sequestered through ecosystem reconstruction. And just a reminder, globally, CO2 equivalent is roughly 51 gigatons. So that is more than twice of all fossil fuels and all food and all everything else if we use that land as a part of a coherent and comprehensive climate strategy. So the amount of additional land that is required if you're growing crops to feed them to animals, as opposed to growing crops to feed them to cells, or growing crops to turn them into plant-based meat, is huge, even independently of everything else that I've been talking about. GFI worked on this report alongside our friends at Climate Advisors and ClimateWorks Foundation. You can find this report. It goes into literally everything that I've said so far is in this report, which is just at gfi.org/climate. It's also at gfi.org/COP26. One of our funders has bought some billboards in Glasgow for COP26, and so now we've got a billboard that talks about alternative proteins, and so we set up a vanity URL at gfi.org/COP26 or gfi.org/climate, and it's got all of the original citations, including the Matthews paper, and literally everything else that I've been talking about, including the pandemic and the antibiotic resistance stuff. So just super quickly on GFI. GFI is, of course, a nonprofit organization. Everything that we do at GFI fits into one of 6 objectives. We use the OKR system popularized by Google. So we have 6 objectives. Every objective has between 5 and 9 key results, and everybody who works at GFI 3 times a year evaluates their work against these key results and measures and recalibrates and all this sort of thing. Our 3 programmatic objectives roughly fall along the lines of science, policy, and industry. So until GFI came along, it was like Pat Brown or Ethan Brown on the plant-based side, or Uma Valetti, or Lou Cooper House, or Mark Post on the cultivated side, and they have the idea, and then boom, they have the company. They have the idea, and then boom, they have the company. And all of the research that they fund, and these companies are wonderful, and we work with these companies, and our industry is absolutely essential. It's been essential to bring down the cost of electric vehicles. See Tesla. It's been essential to bringing down the cost of solar panels. See the private industry incentives in Germany, the US, Japan, and China. Absolutely essential component. But those industries also had a body of open access science and a lot of people in academia, a lot of scientists, helping all of the companies that were going to sprout up to understand the entire sector. And that didn't exist. So of the first 6 people that GFI hired after me, and one person was doing entrepreneurship stuff, in June of 2016, 2 of them were scientists. And the first thing they were charged with doing was figuring out doing a technological readiness assessment on plant-based meat and on cultivated meat, and basically figuring out what do we know, and let's all put it all down in one place. Where are the white spaces? Where are the obvious areas that we need to do significant exploration? And let's put all that down into our technological readiness assessment. What are the critical technology elements? What are the areas that we really need to dive into? Where are the areas of exploration where we don't even know what we don't know yet? And let's start filling those gaps. So our science program does a lot of original research, mostly focused on analyzing knowledge gaps and figuring out what the white space opportunities are for other scientists to come along and do. Put a lot of effort into building a global scientific community and cultivating talent. We have something called the Alternative Protein Project, which is basically the GFI chapter system. And it really requires a lot of the students that launch these chapters. So we have 3 full-time staff members at GFI who work with these 16 chapters. And it's a global program at top universities for ag scientists, for ag science, for food science, for tissue engineering, for plant biology. We do technical workshops and deep dives. We have a monthly webinar, The Science of All Protein. We also have a monthly webinar I'll talk about in a minute called The Business of All Protein, although I just talked about it, so maybe I won't talk about it again in a minute. And then we have 3 donors who give us $5 million a year. And we have 3 grant programs run by GFI. And those grant programs, the sort of biggest one is our competitive grant program, which is generally $250,000 grants for 2 years. And that program has been instrumental. GFI operates not just in the US, we have GFI affiliates in India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific out of Singapore, and Europe out of both Brussels and London. And the grant program allows us to go to scientists and say, we have this pool of money. We saw this research that you did on tissue engineering for therapeutics, and we think it has cross-applicable applications into food. How would you feel about dedicating some of your grad students to this and applying for this grant? Similar with plant biology, similar with biotechnology. So all over the world, we have this pool of money that allows us to build the scientific ecosystem and reach out to professors and principal investigators and say, hey, have you thought about this? And here's this money, and we'll help you apply for it. It also has been instrumental in developing our relationships with governments. So if you are a funder of science, it's very different from being sort of an advocacy NGO. And GFI is a funder of science. Up until this year, we were the biggest funder in North America of science, which is kind of pathetic. It's just $5 million a year. But that is just how nascent this industry is relative to renewable energy and electrification of transport. So that's our science, and it really is sort of the plurality of GFI team members. We have about 140, 145 team members around the world, and our biggest department is our science department. But our battle cry is that government should be funding this. Our battle cry, our global battle cry is that for the same reason governments are funding and incentivizing private sector activity on renewable energy, for the same reason that governments do anything that they do on the Paris Climate Agreement or biodiversity or global health, this transition is something that governments should be behind accelerating. So we advocate for public investment. We work with NSF. We work with USDA. We organized a dozen House members and 3 senators to reach out to John Kerry in advance of the Climate Leaders Summit, working with climate NGOs, including climate advisors at Climate Wars Foundation, to try to get governments to focus on alternative proteins. We worked with Breakthrough Energy. So Breakthrough Energy launched out of Breakthrough Energy Ventures in February. And Bill Gates, the Breakthrough Energy folks, allowed us to talk about the work that we did with them behind the scenes on their federal policy priorities. And then Bill Gates shouted us out on LinkedIn. And I'm sure it was his social media. He said something like, we need climate solutions that work, and GFI is focused on just that. So our person who worked with Breakthrough Energy on their federal policy priorities around alternative proteins posted about that. And then he reposted and said very nice things about GFI. And I'm sure it was his social media person, but it was also his one LinkedIn post of the day. So I think he at least knew that it happened from his account. We were all very excited. We do sign-on letters with members of Congress. We have probably north of 50 congressional champions. We had 47 people sign a Dear Colleague letter asking for alternative protein money, $200 million in reconciliation, and that didn't end up happening. But it's an indication of the amount of support in Congress for this. We did, Rosa DeLauro, who is a real champion of alternative proteins and is the chair of the House Appropriations Committee. She was responsible for getting $5 million allocated for alternative proteins in the USDA budget. But even better, alternative proteins was defined as climate science, and alternative proteins was shouted out explicitly for money under the AFRI budget, the Agriculture and Food Research Institute budget, which is $415 million, and in the next budget will be $450, and if reconciliation passes, will be something like $650. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, or maybe even last week, USDA announced $10 million for a National Institute of Cellular Agriculture, and that is coming out of the AFRI budget. So that's not even the special allocation that Rosa DeLauro created. We work on cultivated meat regulation and making sure that that the food safety protocols are strong, and working globally to ensure that cultivated meat meets with regulatory approval, and that the food safety oversight is robust. And then we work on fair public policy for plant-based meat, for cultivated meat, and for whole biomass and precision fermentation. When we are talking with governments about the importance of funding science in this space, we point out that governments put billions of dollars into ag R&D. Governments put, even pre-COVID, $100 billion plus into global health endeavors, and governments put tens of billions of dollars into renewable energy endeavors. And our ask of governments is both one, there we go, that they fund open access science, 2, that they incentivize private sector research and development, and 3, that they support plant-based and cultivated meat infrastructure and manufacturing build out. So that is what we are trying to get the entire climate and biodiversity communities behind, and through getting the entire climate and biodiversity communities inclined to support these things. This is alternative proteins are the neglected climate solution, and by moving them out of neglect and firmly onto the policy agenda of the NGO community, this is what we are trying to make the outcome become. And then the final thing that we do, the third leg of the stool, is industry engagement. We create startup resources and investor resources. We do, as I mentioned, a monthly Business of Alternative Proteins webinar. We build relationships with and provide insights to all of the world's largest meat and food corporations. When GFI started, we thought we were about the business of disruption. We thought we were disrupting the meat industry. It became very quick. We learned very quickly through our relationships with Tyson and Cargill that disruption isn't our goal. Transformation is our goal. And we have been on lots of panels with Cargill and Tyson and JBS and BRF and ADM and Nestle. And Tyson's former head of sustainability on one of the panels that we organized, he said, we don't want to be disrupted, we want to be the disruption. And that is wonderful in an array of different ways. For one thing, if they are supportive of it, it happens happens a lot more quickly. If they are opposed to it, it happens a lot less quickly, not to put too fine a point on it. But they also have the supply chains, they have the distribution channels, they have the meat scientists. And none of the people at these companies are excited about the external costs of meat production. Their mission is to provide protein to people profitably. That's their mission. Shifting from the way that meat is produced today to making meat from plants and cultivating meat from cells actually has the capacity to be even more profitable while cutting back on all of the external costs that we've been talking about so far. So building those relationships, and then we have a special program, our Sustainable Seafood Initiative. And GFI.org is kind of the Wikipedia of alternative proteins. So if you want to dive into our science work and learn more about science, GFI.org/science. If you want to learn more about our policy work, GFI.org/policy. If you want to be a part of the alternative proteins community, GFI.org/community. If you want to sign up for our newsletters, GFI.org/newsletters. So we try to make it fairly intuitive. I want to find out about climate, GFI.org/climate. So lots and lots of URLs that lead people in the right direction. So these are our three pillars: science and technology, industry, and policy. We have just north of 140 staff across these 6 regions. The GFI purpose is we are developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We identify the most effective solutions. We mobilize resources and talent. We empower partners across the food system to make alternative proteins accessible, affordable, and delicious. And that is, we think, how we win. And that is GFI. We encourage people to sign up at gfi.org/newsletters. And there is how you follow GFI and me on Twitter. And that is it. And I don't know how much time we have, but I am delighted. And I don't. Can we entertain questions from people who are on the webinar?
Yes.
Excellent.
Definitely.
So happy to discuss for however much time we have left.
Great. Well, can we do some claps first? Anybody have more burning questions? No, I can start out with one.
I mean, I think we're going to burn.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being our first in-person speaker since COVID. Yeah, so this is really an honor. And I think you know that I love Good Food Institute, what they're doing. We work closely with many of you, attend things. And I also love that you create the physical newspaper, which I personally have benefited from, but also, you know, you mentioned full page, you know, you still sort of think in this.
Very old school.
Old school. And yet, your talk, I think, is very, very new school in that it's a technocratic approach largely to this problem that you outlined. You know, you're talking about the Browns and the Bill Gateses and the Paul Hopkins. And I guess I want to ask candidly why GFI is not more engaged on the moral license to operate question, especially given that so much of what you're doing is resting on this displacement theory that doesn't seem to prevail in so many other cases that we've already seen, and especially in the seafood case. So I guess I'm sort of wondering, why not diversify the GFI portfolio more to address that question that you front-loaded, which is why aren't more people activated and talking? Why isn't Greta? Why aren't the Union of Concerned Scientists? Why isn't Extinction Rebellion talking about food and meat out front? This doesn't seem to be the place where you're putting a lot of energy.
Yeah, we're pretty convinced, and I'm delighted to engage in conversation. But one of our general counsel and VP for administration has this wonderful metaphor that I really like. And she says, oftentimes the progressive community is like 5-year-olds playing soccer. And everybody, there are like 20 different litmus tests, and everybody has to work on everything. And there's sort of there's a purity test around, you know, you need to take a stand on slaughterhouse workers, and you need to take a stand on land distribution, and you need to take a stand on agricultural consolidation. You need to take a stand on everything. Whereas what we're trying to do is be a professional soccer team where we are laser focused on the question of how do we make the products taste the same or better, and cost the same or less. And our theory, which I think is pretty strong, is both A, that by focusing there, we can, one of our if you go to gfi.org/about, you can see our values, and one of our values is invite everybody to the table. And so our theory of change works for the meat industry. It works for the food industry. It works for Republicans. It works for Democrats. And it is the quickest way that if you care about those 100 million people who just entered into extreme poverty because of COVID, or you care about the end of working antibiotics and the devastation that that's going to wreak on especially the poorest people globally. Same sort of thing with climate change. The value of relegating industrial animal agriculture, shifting from industrial animal agriculture to plant-based and cultivated meat is just colossal. So by being able to work with everybody, we're pretty convinced we can get from A to Z a lot more quickly. We also think that GFI throwing in with what sort of has been the traditional food movement for decades. GFI is literally the only organization that is full-time on almost everything we're doing, and certainly the lobby work. There are at least 50 organizations just in the US working on the broader food justice panoply of activities, and so too in Europe, and so too kind of everywhere. So there's both GFI working on these things wouldn't advance us very much. Wouldn't advance those causes very much, but it would make it a lot harder for us to be successful on the work that we're doing. So that's our analysis.
Can I jump in on this really quickly? So I very much thank you too, Bruce, for your talk. This is really great. I guess I want to follow up a little bit on JJ's point about so there's the social justice component, and there's like these multiple facets across across the meat supply chain that we need to address. But I appreciate your laser sharp focus on one element that can really be developed. I guess the point though about substitution and what's not a substitute, and in some of the research that we've done, we've found some of the companies that you mentioned engaged in sort of denialism, really, and it's entirely plausible for energy companies to invest in alternatives at the same time that they ramp up fossil fuels, right? And this is something that we've noticed. And so there seems to be evidence from what we've encountered, right, that might also be happening across some big meat and dairy companies. And so I appreciate bringing everyone to the table in order to advance the solutions that you're working on, which are needed. But I am curious to hear more about, you talk about the things that you need, but the hurdles that you're facing when you bring these actors to the table, right, knowing that they're also engaged in ramping up their own conventional meat supply chains, meat and dairy supply chains. I understand that you're not actively engaged in trying to affect policy changes to clamp down on that, but that is going to be a constraint or hurdle, I imagine, that you'll face as time goes on. And I'm just wondering how you're thinking about that, and how you're thinking about your products just being on top of versus actually the replacement for, if that makes sense.
I think we get to replacement for by getting the climate community and the biodiversity community and the political community that cares about climate and biodiversity and antibiotic resistance and pandemic risk to help get us to the point, that Daniel commented. They do need to taste the same or better and cost the same or less for significant displacement. So, we saw a 45% growth in plant-based meat in the United States last year. And a lot of that was certainly not displacement. A lot of it was.
Alongside increased meat consumption is the same.
But per capita increased,
Yeah, but the end goal, assuming we get to the place of taste the same or better and cost the same or less, then it becomes a marketing challenge. And especially on the cultivated meat side, if you have the exact same product and it costs less and is not going to have the same bacterial contamination, it's not going to have the same antibiotics and pesticides and other residues, there's not really a strong reason for the conventional meat industry not to shift. So on one hand, yes, they're ramping up conventional even as they move into alternative, but the option is not they move more into alternative. The option is they either do nothing on alternative or they do something on alternative. I mean, at the end of the day, they maximize their bottom line. And anybody who's at CEO level that does something other than maximize the bottom line is going to be replaced as CEO. But we are finding them, Tyson and Cargill have invested in 2 separate cultivated meat companies each. Nestle has a joint venture agreement with a cultivated meat company. All of the 5 largest conventional meat companies in the world have launched plant-based lines. This seems like it is worth encouraging and trying to get them doing more and more and more of that. But yeah, at the end of the day, they're going to respond to markets, which is why, similar to electric vehicles, and now we have by 2035, GM is going to be 100% electric vehicles. Ford is going to be 100% in Europe. These are things that should be encouraged, and I think would have happened a lot more quickly if these companies were looking at electric vehicles 20 years ago and didn't require a Tesla. So we don't think one more nonprofit organization fighting the exact same battle of 50 other nonprofit organizations is much of a value add in those battles. But we do think having tight relationships with these companies and recognizing the constraints that they operate under and helping them to see alternative proteins within the construct of the constraints that they operate under is probably a really good thing. And I will say, they have lots and lots of people at all of these companies who are super enthusiastic and are internal champions for the shift. Cargill's CEO is an internal, he's the CEO and he's an internal champion for the shift. Nestle's CEO is a champion for the shift. They do have to do it within the constraints of being a, publicly, well, Cargill's not publicly traded, but mostly publicly traded corporations. But, to the degree that we can see people as human beings who want to do good in the world, and I think they are human beings who want to do good in the world, we're helping them to move in the right direction. So we think our role is, and we do think, again, alternative proteins, this is the one food solution that works globally with markets. It's the one solution that analogizes to renewable energy and electric vehicles. And the reason, as Bill Gates said, food and ag has been the third rail of climate discussions because everything requires either like massive global coordination, and most things require massive global coordination. They require corporations to do things that define the bottom line. And if you succeed in one country, that hasn't helped you anywhere else in the world. This is the one thing that, like renewable energy and electrification of transport, can simply work with economics, and this can become the way that meat is made.
So I think I'm going to ask a question that's coming up through the chat. So maybe, and this is a lack of my own knowledge, but imagine you reach that place where everybody eats alternative proteins, right? And we don't have any more livestock-based food production. What does that world look like? Like, where does the energy come from? What are the inputs to those, to the meat? Like, is it all soy or diversity of things? And then sort of what are the implications of that for land use and interchange? And also like solar panel arrays or agridiversity. I know it's a big question, but I would love to know what does that world look like and what are problems, new problems maybe that we face there?
Yeah, I will say our assumption is that alternative proteins could and should, assuming it works out, like in the history of the world, there has so far never been a plant-based product that tastes the same or better and costs the same or less. There has also never been a product that came anywhere near costing the same or less on a cultivated side. And there is a lot of science that needs to happen. This is why the climate community should be getting behind this. And also why governments, as a part of their Paris Agreement plans, should be getting behind this. And as Aim for Climate, Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate launches and draws more governments in, alternative proteins should be a significant part of what it is that they're focused on. But we do think this frees up land for regenerative agriculture. We love the work that Climate 180 is doing on regenerative agriculture. I think that can and should be a part of the solution. It also, for people who are willing to pay more, probably creates more economic opportunity for folks who are doing heritage breeds like Frank Reese, the star of the book and the film Eating Animals. So it's not an end of animal agriculture, but it is an end of least common denominator animal agriculture, because plant-based meat and cultivated meat should be able to give consumers everything they like about meat at a lower price. At that point, I mean, we're looking at what are the policies. Like it's what GFI is focused on is let's make products taste the same or better and cost the same or less. But obviously there will be, as this becomes more and more successful, an ecosystem of policy solutions that feed into this. And our assumption is that it should help farmers move away from what has become a sort of farm mantra, get bigger, get out. And instead of 3/4 of global agricultural land being devoted either to growing crops to feed the animals or to grazing, we can have a broader diversity of crops that go in as inputs, and the broader food movement still exists. Like, you know, I am personally, like GFI doesn't organizationally have positions beyond our positions focused on solving climate and biodiversity and everything else. There's this theory of change. But the broader food movement, their work gets easier as we shift in this direction, and there are fewer adverse impacts on land and demand for land. And so does renewable energy. I mean, the one thing that the nuclear folks say with regard to wind and solar, one of the things that they point out is just how much land that requires. You know, both of those, onshore land, fossil fuels is land efficient. This frees up land for, makes renewable energy easier as well as this shift happens. It makes regenerative ranching easier as this shift happens. And our assumption is that the entire food movement will continue to fight for food justice as they should. And that will be a part of this transition as well.
I guess you're the only one who can talk lunch. So not
What's
on
that?
the spot. You're here, but you did not have lunch with me.
Oh,
So
sorry.
it's okay.
Hi, I'm Colin Jones.
Hey.
We realized we didn't do introductions at the beginning. I'm the chair of this department.
Oh, cool.
Well, the one thing I guess I think some of the questions have already danced around it, but I guess I'm curious about you didn't talk as much as I expected about the pushback as far as, so there's fights about labeling, right? Whether we get to label this meat at all, which points to, I think, a broader sort of, I certainly think that, and there's evidence that the more of this stuff gets cheaper and tastes more like real meat, the more there are people willing to eat it. But I guess in my own mind, and certainly I don't know the research, but in my own mind, at least to date, a lot of those people that are moving into this space and eating more of it are flexitarians. So they're environmentally minded, looking for reasons that they can still eat meat, but willing to eat less of it and more open to. So I guess I'm still, I could see how lab-grown meat versus plant-based might get some of those people. If they're just in the supermarket, this chicken's cheaper than that chicken, I'm gonna buy it. They may not even know that it's lab-grown or care. But then that's where you see huge pushback among groups of people that wanna make sure you know, right? So then that's where then I find myself just wondering, so if there's that battle going on and I'm a consumer that is let's imagine a scenario, I'm in a supermarket and something that is lab grown chicken has to say it all over it because the meat lobby pushed for that or farmers push for that. And it is the same price. What is it going to take to make me then still choose it? And will I be convinced by, now we are getting to the education side, like, well, it doesn't have traces of antidepressants in it. Is that going to convince me, or is it really about, like, in my mind I see, because I still have bucolic farm versus lab, and so that's going to push me. So I guess you could say more about that.
Yeah, just sort of a nomenclature thing, not hugely consequential, but at the outset, it's not lab grown. Tyson and Cargill and JBS, they all have meat labs. So meat science is a thing, even outside of plant-based and cultivated meat, and like everything, Cheerios and cornflakes start a food lab too. They're produced in factories.
Sure.
So it's not lab meat, and the nomenclature we've landed on is cultivated meat, 75% of the CEOs prefer cultivated meat for consumers, which is not a huge consequence, but and not directly related to your question. I do think people right now eat meat despite how it's produced. They don't eat meat because of how it's produced. So much so that, as you all know, they're literally passing laws to make it illegal to find out what happens on modern farms and in modern slaughterhouses. So one of the things Uma Valetti at Upside Foods talks about is he says, we'll stream live on the internet our production processes. It'll get boring in about 5 seconds because you're just looking at a cultivator. But let the cameras in, let the tours happen. So you literally have products that have a fraction of the likelihood of causing food of being contaminated. Like they're gonna, something like 80, Consumer Reports I think found like 80% of chicken has Campylobacter or salmonella on it. Goes to really close to zero. It's basically the same as plant-based meat, which is really close to zero with both plant-based meat and cultivated meat. No possibility of any kind of drug residues. I do think at the end of the day, it is a niche group of folks who are going to care about that argument until it costs less. And so that's why we need the climate community. That's why we need governments. We need the products to cost less. But the early numbers on people who want to eat cultivated meat are really high. And you think about plant-based meat, right now it's less than 1% by volume. It's about 1.4% in the US by sales. And the worst numbers, even when you call it lab-grown meat, like we are, as human beings, biologically programmed to be afraid of things that are novel where food is concerned because it's likely to kill you. So the fact that somewhere between 30 and 70% of people, like 30 is the worst percentage that you can get when you call it in vitro meat or lab-grown meat, still want to eat cultivated meat. And I think that's an indication. I think it's not going to be hard if we can get to the price points. I think it is not going to be hard for the meat, and ideally the meat industry shifts in this direction. That's another reason that getting the meat industry selling their own plant-based meats in terms of like mainstreaming it and making it seem, this is just a different way of producing meat. We've got a Tyson label or a Cargill label or a Hormel label, and it's we've got our animal-based meat and our plant-based meat. Just thoroughly normalizes it for people.
If I just who's really pushing, who's up in arms about these labels then? I guess I presumed it was driven by the traditional meat industry, which you're saying is more of a partner in this than
No, it's got a 0%. I mean, the meat labeling restrictions has very close to a 0% chance of passing at the federal level. So it's passing in state legislatures where there are a lot of cattle ranchers or dairy farmers who are state legislators. And in the US, it has vanishingly little chance of passing constitutional muster. But no, I mean, the legislation gets proposed because dairy farmers or cattle ranchers will have it proposed at the federal level. But A, it wouldn't pass constitutional muster, but B, it also doesn't have almost any political support, really.
But the dairy companies and meat companies that they're selling to aren't saying don't do that.
I think North American Meat Institute has officially come out in favor of calling cultivated meat, and has said, in fact, you have to call it meat because it is meat. On the plant-based meat side, I don't think they have taken a position. I mean, one of the things both Tyson and Cargill have talked about publicly is how their traditional constituency is not super excited about them going into plant-based and cultivated meat, so the farmers themselves are not excited. But those companies are not, they're not making any issue of labeling, and their trade groups are not making an issue of labeling. But it really is just, a small number of cattle ranchers and dairy farmers.
I ask, if this is successfully able to scale up, then there's presumably going to be like a much lower need for food inputs to the livestock system. So what do you think should happen to potentially all that freely available land, and then also the farmers who were supplying livestock facilities? What do you think should happen to the land and those people?
I think we need just transition programs. So I think we need that. I think we need policies, and I think we can learn from fossil fuel transition what just transition looks like. There will be better jobs for people in rural communities, and the factories can be set up in a broader diversity of communities. So you're replacing the slaughterhouse jobs, which Human Rights Campaign said is America's human rights crime. There have been multiple exposés just like how bad these jobs are, with much better jobs. And then for folks who are actually raising animals, I think we need to look at what just transition looks like. I will say that this shift is not going to happen as fast. I mean, like, this shift is not going to happen more quickly than agricultural consolidation and go big or get out has happened, but it obviously will have impacts, and there need to be a robust policy initiative to deal with those impacts as it transitions.
And what do you see happening to the land itself?
Well, I like Matthew's vision of ecosystem revitalization from his nature sustainability paper. I mean, the main thing is right now, because meat consumption is supposed to go up 70 to 100% by 2050. What that means is more and more rainforest burned down, and let's stop burning down the rainforest, and more pressure on land, and let's stop putting that pressure on land. As part of a comprehensive climate or biodiversity program, you could see ecosystem revitalization happen as a part of what's happening on that land. As we transition to renewable energy, you could also see a lot of that land devoted to onshore wind and solar production and other forms of renewable energy that require a lot more land than fossil fuels. But I mean, I guess it depends on whether it's part of a comprehensive policy or markets just rule. But it'll, no matter what, it's better than how the land is being used now.
Yeah, I want to clarify one thing about the paper, which is how much we take a very passive approach to what happens on the land after farming is moved off of it. I think there's this really big misconception that ecosystem restoration consists of people going out and planting trees in the ground, because that's what, Ecosia and all of these other, offset kind of companies market their restoration is consisting of. But in our modeling, we assume that it just reverts to whatever non-disturbed state exists in. Most ecosystems globally will return to having denser vegetation if you do nothing to it, just due to natural seed dispersal. And I think that's an important point in the kind of larger vision making, because it's already happened. We have basis for it. It's why upstate New York and New Hampshire are now covered in red maples and oak trees, because we just decided to stop economics, decided to just stop farming there.
Yeah.
So we have a bit of a test bed. Granted, most of that got moved up to the Midwest, and there's devastation that's happening there, but it's kind of a literal picture of what could happen to other places on the earth. Trees just want to be in those environments.
Yeah,
No one went out and planted maple trees.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I also like Ezra Klein in his New York Times column, "A Moonshot for Meatless Meat," talks about, further to your question about farmers. Those folks know what ecosystem renewal looks like. Like, farmers are not monocropping because they're excited about monocropping, and they're not using unsustainable practices because they're excited about using unsustainable practices. They're doing that because that's what the market demands. So moving from demanding that of farmers to helping farmers with more holistic / ecosystem friendly farming practices could be and should be a part of a comprehensive shift in this direction.
Well, we have about 3 minutes left. I have like 5 questions about what is fermented meat. So maybe you could talk to that and then we can wrap up, because it seems to be a popular question.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one where if you go to gfi.org/ I think it's just fermentation, but if you go to gfi.org, in the upper left-hand corner, you will see plant-based cultivated fermentation.
Okay.
And there are 2 forms of fermentation. Well, I guess there are 3 actually. And we have state of the industry reports. So if you go to gfi.org/industry and scroll down, you can see our entire fermentation and plant-based and cultivated reports. And they dive into the science, they dive into the investment ecosystem, they dive into the entrepreneurial ecosystem. But for fermentation, there are things like tempeh, which is old school fermentation, sort of like taking soybeans, and similar to how kimchi is made. There's whole biomass fermentation, which interestingly is probably, is even more efficient than plant-based meat at creating a whole biomass designed to replicate meat. There's a company, the company that's sort of the quintessential this is literally the biggest alternative meat company in the world. It's called Corn. It is by far the biggest in Europe, and I think it's like 5th or 6th in the US, but it is huge. And they use whole biomass fermentation, which is basically taking fungi. It's very similar to how cultivated meat works, except they do it with fungi. And then there are multiple, so they were formed, I think they were formed like decades ago. And then the second company came along like 5 years ago. This is one of the companies Bill Gates is most excited about, called Nature's Fine, which is based in the Chicago stockyards, which is kind of cool. And they're using a fungi that they found in Yellowstone, but you don't have to go back to it. So you just get similar to you take a biopsy from an animal and feed the biopsy and the cells multiply and grow. That's essentially what whole biomass fermentation involves, but generally using fungi. And then precision fermentation is what companies like Perfect Day and Clara Foods and Geltor are doing. It's also how the heme in the Impossible Burger is made. It's also how more than 95% of rennet, that is an ingredient of cheese, is made in the United States. Pre-1990, all rennet came from calf stomachs. And I don't remember when insulin started being made this way, but insulin also used to come from pigs. And now they use precision fermentation, and you basically just get the genetics of the protein, and you program those genetics into yeast or bacteria. There's a company called Nobel Foods that's doing this in soy, and it creates the end protein. So whether that's a dairy protein or an egg protein, or insulin or whatever other protein. But that's the super distilled explanation. We on our science page, it like dives into all of the science of each of the technologies.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Bruce. That was definitely. Thank you to our online camera. Thank you to our online folks as well. And we'll hopefully see you guys at the next webinar, which I remember we date November 11th, right? What's that with Ben Process?